Hello everyone, welcome to this first art process video that I'm posting up, and thank you for all your votes on all of my social media platforms. I kind of added them up, and the winner was Dealer's Choice, surprisingly enough, and so I decided to sort of hit two birds with one stone. For this picture, I wanted to draw Minu from my comic Legend Catcher, and with her I wanted to draw a creature, and I decided on the Minogame. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. It's a Japanese lucky turtle, and sometimes apparently turtles will have moss growing on their backs, and it looks kind of like a hairy tail in a sort of way, and it looks really cool. And they were in one or two Japanese fairy tales, and I just really wanted to give it a shot, and I also wanted to draw a turtle, and so I'm giving it a whirl with this. Now, for those who don't know, I have a webcomic called Legend Catcher, and it is basically the adventures of Fitzwilliam O'Reilly, who is a will-o'-the-wisp in a suit of armor, as a monster biologist. He's a mythos biologist who wants to save the monsters rather than slay them. So this is one of the characters that works in the lab. Her name is Minu. She's a student working in botany. She wants to study plants, and she helps Fitz with the lab when he's on missions and stuff, because he's pretty much the only guy who can withstand a lot of these monsters who like to bite and destroy things. But with this, I wanted to make a poster size, and I'm working in Clip Studio Paint these days. It's such an intuitive program. I love what it does. I'm the most comfortable in it. I can also work in Photoshop, but this one just has wormed its way into my heart as an art program. Now, the first thing I do is I gather references. I bring up my character design for Minu and the color palette that I have chosen for her and her outfit, and the design notes and everything, just to make sure I'm on track. And I gather up references for the aesthetic of the piece, and also for the creature that I want to design with her. I shouldn't say creature, because it's literally just a giant turtle with moss growing on its back, but I just kind of imagine it has magical properties in this case. But I like to gather all of my references in a singular image file to put to the side here. And I like to keep the references on the side just to keep them a little more handy and a little more accessible for working. The next part of it is I do the sketching, and with sketching I like to put out a layout. I'm trying to do sort of a staging in this case. I'm trying to figure out the space and what angle looks the best for what I want to achieve. And in this case, you kind of have to imagine that you have a camera with you and you have your subjects, and you're trying to figure out, okay, what do I put it at mid view or worm's eye view or eco view or anything like that. So it's more along just like setting up the stage and then figuring out what angle I want to put it at. And I usually use a bigger brush with this at a very light blue, because when I work on physical paper, I usually draw in like a non-photo blue pencil, and then I tighten up the sketches with a darker blue mechanical pencil to get the details in. And that's what I like to do in Clip Studio Paint, is that I have a bigger brush with sort of a false non-photo blue and then a little bit of a darker blue for tightening up the sketches and filling out details and figuring out proportions. And during this, I also like to flip the canvas just to see if the proportions are wonky, because if you look at a picture at the same angle close up for too long, you're gonna lose details. You're gonna only have that one viewpoint. So it's good to either step away, look at it from a distance, zoom out, and or flip the canvas a little bit and adjust the proportions and everything. The next thing I like to do is I like to add in the lines and inking. My taste in inking is that I really like sort of a little bit of a varying weight of the inks, mostly because I'm a huge fan of Svetlana Shimakova's work, like Dramacon and Night School, and Jeff Smith's Bone. Oh my gosh, the inking in Bone is absolutely gorgeous. It's just a good comic all around. I highly recommend Bone, unless you have a reading disorder or dyslexia. It might be kind of tough just because the first part of the series is so gosh darn wordy, but either that or you could just buy the art of book, and it's just so beautiful. So I like to add in my lines, and after I get the basic lines down to get the characters, I really like to go in and add extra inks. I want to darken up a couple of spots where the light will not hit in its heaviest in shadow, and the opposite of where the light is coming from, to add a little more weight to that area. And again, this is sort of cues from looking at Svetlana's work over the years. I remember seeing her work at first from How to Draw Fantasy Worlds by Christopher Hart, How to Draw books. If any of you remember those, give a shout out there, because holy cow, that is kids about in the early 2000s and late 1990s. There was a thing called Barnes & Noble before the advent of the internet. Now, Barnes & Noble had these things called How to Draw books and tutorials and everything. Instead of the social medias, we went over there, bought that, and kind of crouched down in those areas to not only consume How to Draw from professionals, but also went a couple aisles over to crouch and read manga as fast as we could so we didn't have to buy the whole volume sets. Oh no. Oh, what a weird era. Next, with my process, especially with a big piece like this, I like to put in sort of flat colors, and these aren't the official colors of the piece. This is more like the differentiating shapes that are going to help me fill in later, because for coloring, especially when it's a new piece, it's a lot of trial and error to see what's going to look good. And so this is just sort of a save point to where I can select a certain character or a certain element of the background and really figure it out from there. And this really helps me with that. So I learned this technique from watching Coloring with Kurt, and Kurt is a professional comic book colorist, and his videos are absolutely incredible. I highly recommend them for anyone who wants to learn more about coloring and how to make your art pop, because he explains color in such a unique way that for some reason sunk into my brain more than all of my years in going into college with my minor in fine arts. It's absolutely incredible, and his videos are so informative, and he goes over how to color in different art programs, and it's absolutely amazing. I highly recommend him. But this is one of the techniques I like to use to sort of streamline, and I actually do this flatting sort of thing for my comics too, just so that I can select one color for the same character in multiple panels and just kind of fill those up real quick. The next thing I like to do is I like to color the characters first with the colors, character bases. And for Minu, this is easy because I already planned out which colors I'm going to use. She has a color palette I can pick, and I can drop them into the character. And I like to use the magic fill tool because I am a singular person working on multiple pages of comics, and I'm a one-woman show when it comes to Legend Catcher and everything else that I do. So until I have the money to properly pay a colorist for what they deserve, I will do this alone, and I will use as many shortcuts as I can because I do not have the time or the money to do so, and I highly applaud people for having teams, that is for sure, but I will not be hiring anyone until I have enough money to give them what because they are, they're angels of the night, they are saviors of comics, and I cannot praise good colorists enough. They're a blessing. After that, I then color the Minogame, and for new characters and new creatures, when I color them, I really need to, for the first time at least, I really need time to figure out what colors are going to work best for them. And at first, it's more like I am going to color what I kind of imagined in my head, and then I have to look at that compared to the rest of the piece and figure out, is this going to make the creature or character pop? Am I going to leave my eye to this? Does this look okay? And is this going to work later on and not make everything so cluttered? Because there's another, I'll get to talking about visual climax here in a minute, but it really is a lot of trial and error when it comes to a new scene, either in a comic or a new picture for a poster or a print or something. So the next thing I like to try to do is the background. Now, again, I have the elements, the basic elements in the flats layers to select and figure all that out. And at first, what I really wanted to do was I wanted to make sort of a pond and sort of a grassy bush sort of area. And I struggled a bit in this. There was a lot of trial and error. And I don't think artists, whether it's writing or visual arts, talk enough about struggling and just trial and error, because we don't pop out a piece knowing exactly what we're gonna want 100% of the time. We really have to experiment and figure out how to translate the idea we have in our heads into the physical realm or the digital realm, because it's not as easy as that. Our brains are figuring out how to translate something that is purely in our imaginations with our hands or any tools that we are using, and it's sort of a lost in translation sometimes when it comes to that. Now, at first I was trying to do something like semi-realistic with the digital painting, and I was thinking, oh, I'm gonna have every strand of grass, and I'm gonna have all these textures and blah blah blah. But after a while, I stopped and I just knew this was not working for me. And then I thought, okay, what is it about background paintings that attract me to them? And I remember that I really love the background paintings for Legend of Korra, and that's a bit more abstract. It really does let itself use shape language and textures that sort of evoke a postmodernist sense. And so I decided, okay, I'm going to use less detail and more painterly textures, and I'm going to use the square brush. I'm just going to go for it. I'm going to let out sort of my inner postmodernist artist in this, and it felt much better, and it looked a bit better to me, and it felt more like what I wanted to convey on the page, really, because someone once described the synergy between a animated 2D figure with hard cell shades versus this sort of painterly background, and I love that concept, really. And it really guides the eye to the viewpoint of the piece. Now, I'm gonna now talk about visual climax, because I feel like this is so important, and I feel like this is why I'm attracted to 2D animation, because for all y'all who don't know, I am on the autism spectrum, and I'm very visual and I'm very auditorial. And when it comes to visual stuff, sensory-wise, the real world is cluttered all the time. There's so much coming in with touch and scent and sight and hearing and everything. Just, it's so overwhelming. And in cartoons, they guide the eye to what is important. It's not as cluttered. So when I say visual climax, I'm talking about when the artist purposefully leads the eye of the audience to the most important viewpoint. And that includes where to put the most detail, where to put the most contrast, where to put the most or least amount of texture, and what's really going to stand out from the rest of the piece. And that's why I decided to go for a more painterly background, because it's not going to be as defined, it's going to be a bit more soft, and it's not going to detract you from the two characters in the center of the piece. And it becomes more and more detailed with the point which I would like the audience to look at. Now, of course, like if you're sitting there in, like, I don't know, a dentist's office or your house or whoever buys this print, you can just sort of lead your eye around the piece and just sort of figure all that out and just sort of zone out. I mean, that's perfectly fine, and I actually like doing that sometimes with screenshots of animated features that I really like, but the painterly background just helps not clutter the piece. There's not extra sensory going on, and it also just adds that nice synergy. I like that word, synergy, to the piece. And I also struggled a little bit with the water too, admittedly, to be honest, because, you know, in grade school you're taught water is blue. So when I was trying to get the layers going for that, I messed around with a lot of blending modes and textures and all that stuff, and I finally figured out one of the layers for the water was best when it was multiplied. So it works best. Again, play around with different brushes, play around with different techniques, play around with the blending modes, because I will tell you, traditional art and digital art are difficult because art is hard. The only difference between digital and traditional art is that digital art is faster and it's more forgiving. You could just have the undo button, it's Control Z. You don't have that with traditional pieces. Usually it's best for a traditional piece to create sort of a test painting or a little mini doodle or something to figure out what you want to do ahead of time and make all the mistakes there. But for digital pieces, you could just kind of go in and figure it out as you go and fix anything on the fly. It's still very difficult, but there's more undos than you can with traditional pieces, unless you know you're very brave and you can try different chemicals and materials to try and fake those things out. But I would rather just plan ahead. Don't play with too many chemicals, just plan ahead. The next part, and this is one of my favorite parts of art. I love all of the process with writing and visual arts, but I'm a sucker for lighting. I am a huge theater kid, and I love seeing a series that plays with lighting and has high contrasts and plays with glows and all this stuff. That is why, as a high schooler, I was such a fan of Hellsing Ultimate's lighting. That just was visual fangirling for me. Just that they had the moonlight sort of glow and they had very dark shadows and they made it feel like the characters were a little bit more 3D without being visually cluttered. Like a lot of 3D animated features, which are beautiful, they add a lot of texture, they add a lot of lighting, they add a lot of volume, they add a lot of extra stimuli, which is fine for some people, but it's not really for me because it's extra stuff for my brain to add in, along with sitting in the theater, smelling the popcorn, hearing kids crying, and just a lot of extra stimuli. So I kind of like to pull back a little bit as far as that. And also I just love seeing pictures literally moving on the screen. That's another thing that I love. So when it comes to lighting, I take a lot of cues from animated features, but also add a little bit of a gradient as well too. I do that with the hair, and I do that with some of the lighting. And another thing too is I also play with other layers, because usually I have sort of a multiply mode for shading, and I do screen mode for the highlights. And sometimes I like to use the hard light mode to try different ambiance colors. I tried a little bit of blue to make it look like they were in a glass greenhouse, and it didn't really work for me. But when I went for more of a warmer yellow, it looked so much better. It looked like sunlight, and it really pulled the piece together. So I put that in, and I selected different tones and stuff. And honestly, I can go way more into detail of how I do my piece as an experiment if I did like a live stream or a full-on couple hours tutorial just sitting there talking as I go. But basically, again, I highly recommend going to Coloring with Kurt. He's got a lot more in-depth information about different techniques and colors and stuff like that, and it's really great. So I sort of added in this sort of yellow, and I put in like a color dodge, and it looked like sunlight peeking through the canopy of the trees, and I really liked that. So I put that in the last minute there. The other thing, and again, I learned this from Kurt, I'm not sorry, because colorists really deserve all the praise and all of the pay and admiration that they get, because it just really pulls a piece together. But I then put on a black and changed it to another color as well, and put it on the blending mode hue. For when it's on black, I can check what the value tones are, and then when it's in a color, I can figure out where the saturation is, and that way I can double check where the eye is being led, and I can change certain things if it feels like the eye is being led somewhere else, or if it's too distracting, or if the center of the piece is not standing out enough. So that really helps me in that regard. So that is basically how I pulled this together. This was a very ambitious picture, and I did not go into this thinking I was gonna put in this much effort into this, but I love how this turned out, and I really liked that I learned so much during this, and this is just a nice scene that I had in my head, and I love that Minu gets to share a little tea with a giant lucky Japanese turtle. So thank you all so much for participating, and hopefully this has brought you a little bit into my chaotic art process. And if you want to see more, let me know. I hope you have a good day. Take care of yourself. Be yourself. Have an awesome day. Thank you.